She's pregnant, but it's not yours. The words hit me like a wrecking ball, tearing through the foundation of my life in an instant. I stared at the doctor, my mouth dry, heart thudding in my chest. My wife, Emily, was sitting beside me, pale, hands trembling. The doctor's voice faded into the background as my mind grappled with the implications. Pregnant. Not mine. How? I glanced at her. Emily's eyes filled with guilt, and something more. Fear, perhaps. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out, as if the enormity of the moment had stolen her words. My chest tightened, a slow burn starting in my stomach. I felt like I was going to be sick. The truth that she had betrayed me, that she had been sleeping with someone else, was too much to process. For months, we'd been trying for a baby. The countless doctor's visits, the tests, the hope that each time, this would be it. Every negative pregnancy test was a small dagger in our dreams. But I had never given up. I had never once considered the possibility that Emily might have turned elsewhere, that she would betray me in such an unforgivable way. The doctor cleared his throat awkwardly and handed me a pamphlet. I didn't even glance at it. My eyes were glued to Emily, who now sat hunched over, avoiding my gaze. She knew. She knew it wasn't mine, and yet she let me believe that this child growing inside her was the result of our love. When? My voice came out more like a growl than a question. I couldn't look at her any longer. The image of her in bed with another man flashing before my eyes like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I'm so sorry, Emily whispered, her voice cracking. It just happened. I didn't mean for any of this to... Didn't mean for this to happen? I barked, cutting her off. You didn't mean to cheat on me? To get pregnant by another man? How the hell does that happen by accident, Emily? She flinched, tears brimming in her eyes. Good, I thought bitterly. Let her cry. Let her feel the weight of what she's done. My hands clenched into fists, my knuckles white. I wanted to scream, to yell, to break something, but the overwhelming pain of betrayal kept me rooted to the spot. The doctor stood, sensing the tension, and quietly excused himself, leaving us alone in the sterile office. The silence stretched between us, heavy and oppressive. Finally, Emily looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. I didn't want it to go this far, she whispered. I made a mistake, and I regret it. Please, John, I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. Who is he? I asked coldly. Who's the father of your child? Her lips trembled and she wiped at her tears with shaky hands. It's someone from work, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. His name is Marcus. Marcus. The name was like poison on my tongue. I knew him. He was the new guy in her office, the one she had mentioned a few times over dinner, the one who was just a friend. The one I had never thought to worry about because I trusted her. Or at least, I'd trusted her. How long? I demanded, my voice harsh, unforgiving. She hesitated, then said, 6 months. 6 months, half a year. She'd been lying to me for half a year. Every kiss, every smile, every night in bed together, it was all a lie. I felt like I didn't even know the woman sitting in front of me anymore. Are you in love with him? I asked, my throat tight, barely able to get the words out. The thought of her loving someone else was almost worse than the physical betrayal. No, she said quickly. It was never about that. I don't love him. I love you, John. I've always loved you. I shook my head, disbelieving. You've got a hell of a way of showing it. Her hands reached for mine, but I pulled away. I couldn't stand to touch her. I know I've hurt you, she said desperately. But I want to make this right. I want to fix things. Please, John, give me a chance to make this right. My mind swirled with confusion and anger. How could we ever come back from this? How could I ever trust her again, knowing what she had done? The woman I had married, the woman I thought I would spend the rest of my life with, had destroyed everything. I stood up abruptly, my chair screeching across the tile floor. I can't do this, I muttered, heading for the door. "John, wait!" Emily called after me. But I was already halfway down the hallway, my feet moving on autopilot, my mind in a fog. I needed to get out of there, to breathe, to escape the suffocating reality that had just swallowed my life whole. I stumbled out into the parking lot, gasping for air like I had been drowning. My hands shook as I fumbled for my car keys, barely managing to unlock the door before collapsing into the driver's seat. My vision blurred with unshed tears, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely and utterly lost. I spent that night in a cheap motel, the kind with flickering neon signs and walls so thin you could hear the conversations of your neighbors. The room reeked of old cigarette smoke and stale beer, but I didn't care. I needed to be alone. I couldn't go home. Not after what had happened. I couldn't face Emily. Not yet. My mind kept replaying the doctor's words over and over like a broken record. She's pregnant, but it's not yours. It was like a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from, each repetition twisting the knife deeper into my chest. Emily's tear-streaked face haunted me, the guilt in her eyes, the regret in her voice. But regret couldn't erase the betrayal. Regret couldn't undo the fact that she had slept with another man, that she had carried on an affair for 6 months. And now, she was carrying his child. I hadn't told anyone yet. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. Another missed call from Emily. She had been calling non-stop since I walked out of the doctor's office. I couldn't bring myself to answer. What was there to say? Every time I thought about her, my stomach turned with anger, disgust, and a deep, aching sadness. I thought about calling my best friend, Dave. He'd know what to say, how to help me navigate through this mess. But I didn't want to admit to anyone what had happened. Saying it out loud made it too real. So I sat there, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the past few months in my mind, searching for the signs I had missed. How had I been so blind? It was 3 a.m. before exhaustion finally pulled me into a restless sleep. But even in my dreams, there was no escape. I dreamed of Emily and Marcus, of the two of them together, laughing, touching, her body pressed against his. I dreamed of the child growing inside her, a child that wasn't mine. I woke up with a start, my heart racing, drenched in sweat. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting an orange glow through the dirty motel curtains. For a brief moment, I hoped that it had all been a terrible dream, that I would wake up and everything would be normal again. But reality came crashing down as soon as I saw my phone. Dozens of missed calls and texts from Emily, each one more frantic than the last. I threw on my clothes and left the motel, heading back to my car. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't go home. Not yet. I drove aimlessly for hours, the city passing by in a blur, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. By mid-morning, I found myself parked outside a small cafe on the edge of town. I hadn't eaten since the day before, but I had no appetite. Still, I needed to clear my head, and sitting in my car wasn't helping. I went inside, ordered a coffee, and sat at a corner table, staring blankly out the window. I wasn't sure how long I sat there before my phone buzzed again. Another text from Emily. "Please come home. We need to talk. I love you." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Love? How could she claim to love me after what she had done? But the truth was, despite everything, part of me still loved her. That was the cruelest part of all. Even after her betrayal, even after knowing that she was carrying another man's child, I couldn't just shut off my feelings. We had been together for 8 years, married for 5. We had built a life together. And now, it was all unraveling. I stared at her message, torn between the anger that burned inside me and the small, desperate part of me that wanted to believe her, that wanted to believe that we could somehow fix this. But how do you fix something so broken? After a long, agonizing moment, I typed a reply. "I'll be home later. We'll talk." The drive back to the house felt longer than usual, each mile stretching out like an eternity. My mind raced with the conversation that was waiting for me when I got there. What was I supposed to say? How could I even begin to process everything that had happened? I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready to face her, to face the truth of what our marriage had become. When I pulled into the driveway, the house felt foreign to me, like I was about to walk into someone else's life. The home we had shared, the place where we had dreamed of starting a family, now felt tainted by the weight of Emily's betrayal. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air was thick with tension. Emily was sitting on the couch, her face pale, her eyes swollen from crying. She stood up when she saw me, but I held up a hand to stop her from coming any closer. "Don't," I said, my voice rough. "Just don't." She froze, her eyes wide with fear and regret. I could see she wanted to reach out to me, to try to make things right, but there was a chasm between us now that felt impossible to bridge. We stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity before I finally spoke. "Tell me everything," I demanded. "I want to know how this happened." Her lower lip trembled, and she wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold herself together. "It was a mistake," she whispered. "A horrible mistake. I was feeling lonely. We were trying so hard to have a baby, and when it wasn't happening, I felt like I was failing you. I wasn't thinking straight." "So you decided the best solution was to sleep with someone else?" I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Great plan, Emily." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but I didn't feel sorry for her. Not anymore. "It wasn't like that," she insisted. "It was just, Marcus was there. We started talking, and I don't know. One thing led to another. I didn't mean for it to happen." I clenched my fists, trying to control the anger that surged inside me. "How many times?" I asked. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. "A few," she admitted quietly. "A few?" I repeated incredulously. "So this wasn't just a one-time thing? You kept seeing him?" She nodded, barely able to meet my eyes. I stood there, the weight of her confession pressing down on me like a boulder I could never hope to lift. The room felt small, suffocating, and for a moment I had to remind myself to breathe. "A few times," I repeated slowly, letting the words sink in, though each syllable felt like a blade slicing through whatever remained of my trust. "You kept seeing him. You kept choosing him." Emily flinched, her tears falling faster now, but I couldn't bring myself to care. Not anymore. I felt like I was drowning in the anger, in the betrayal. And now, the woman I thought I knew had become a stranger carrying another man's child. "John," she began, her voice pleading, "I never meant to hurt you. It was a mistake. I regret everything I did with Marcus. I regret ever letting it happen. Please, you have to believe me." I stared at her, the love I had once felt for her now tangled with disgust and sorrow. How could she ask for my belief? How could she beg for my understanding when every choice she made over the past 6 months had shattered our life together? "You regret it?" I echoed bitterly. "You regret getting caught, Emily. That's all this is. If you hadn't gotten pregnant, would you have told me? Or would you have let me keep living in this lie?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her silence was enough. She would have kept it going. The affair, the deceit, the lies, they wouldn't have stopped. Not until it suited her. I turned away from her, my hands shaking. I couldn't bear to look at her anymore. The memories of us, the nights we spent laughing, planning for a future, trying for a baby, tainted now, blackened by the shadow of her betrayal. And Marcus, his name alone was enough to send a fresh wave of fury through me. "John, please," Emily cried, moving closer. I could hear her footsteps approaching. "We can get through this. We can fix this. I know I've hurt you, but I love you. I love us. I don't want to lose everything we've built." I felt her hands graze my arm, but I jerked away from her touch like it burned. "Don't," I snapped, my voice colder than I had ever heard it. "You don't get to say you love me. Not after this." Her sobs filled the room, and for a moment, I wanted to feel something, anything other than the hollow ache in my chest. I wanted to scream at her, to ask her why. But what would that change? The damage was done. I turned to face her again, and the sight of her, broken, crying, begging only deepened my resolve. "I can't do this, Emily," I said quietly, though the weight behind my words was anything but soft. "I can't look at you and see the woman I married. All I see now is the one who betrayed me." "John, no," she sobbed, shaking her head in desperation. "Do you even know if you're going to keep the baby?" I asked, my voice flat, emotionless. She paused, and for a second I saw the conflict in her eyes. It was a question that had clearly tormented her as much as it tormented me. Her hands went to her stomach and she looked down, her face a mix of uncertainty and guilt. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to do." That was it. That was the moment I realized I had already lost her, and not just to Marcus, but to the weight of everything she had done. Whether she kept the baby or not didn't matter. The child wasn't mine, and neither was the future we had once dreamed of. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice firm, final. Her eyes snapped up to meet mine, wide with panic. "What? No, John, you can't. We can still—" "No," I cut her off, my voice firm. "We can't fix this. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." She broke down completely then, collapsing to her knees in front of me, her body racked with sobs. But I didn't move to comfort her. I couldn't. Not anymore. Without another word, I turned and walked out the door, the sound of her cries following me like a ghost as I stepped into the cold night air. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and drove away, feeling the crushing weight of what I'd just left behind, but also the small, flickering relief of finally escaping a future I didn't recognize. The next few weeks were a blur of lawyers, phone calls, and dividing our lives into pieces. The house, the bank accounts, the belongings, all the things that had once symbolized our future were now mere items to be split, parceled out like spoils of war. I stayed with my best friend Dave during the separation. He offered support, but mostly, he offered silence when I needed it. He didn't ask for details, and I didn't volunteer them. He knew me well enough to understand that I wasn't ready to talk about what had happened. Emily and I didn't speak much during the divorce proceedings. Everything was handled through our lawyers, and I avoided seeing her in person as much as possible. The few times I did have to face her, sitting across from her in some cold, sterile office, she looked hollow, like the life had been drained out of her. I felt no satisfaction in that. If anything, it made the whole thing feel more tragic, like we were both casualties of something we couldn't undo. I heard through a mutual friend that she ended things with Marcus shortly after I left. Apparently he wasn't interested in playing dad. The child she was carrying, the child that had destroyed our marriage, wasn't enough to keep him around. I wasn't surprised. Men like Marcus weren't built for commitment. They were built for excitement, for fleeting pleasures that never lasted. Emily chose to keep the baby in the end. I heard that too, though not from her. She was going to be a single mother, raising a child that would forever remind her of her mistakes. A part of me pitied her for the road ahead, but another part of me, perhaps the larger part, felt relieved. It wasn't my burden to carry anymore. I moved into a new apartment on the other side of town, away from the memories that haunted every corner of the house we had shared. It was small, but it was mine. A fresh start, even if it didn't feel like one at first. At night, the loneliness would creep in, filling the silence with thoughts of what could have been. I found myself staring at the empty side of the bed more often than I liked to admit, wondering if I had made the right choice. But then I would remember the betrayal, the lies, the pain, and I knew, deep down, that there was no going back. The healing process was slow, agonizing at times. I had loved her. God, I had loved her with everything I had. But love wasn't enough to erase what she had done. It wasn't enough to fix the shattered pieces of our life together. One evening, months after the divorce was finalized, I found myself sitting in a coffee shop, much like the one I had gone to the day after I learned the truth. Only this time, I wasn't drowning in pain. I was just there, existing, and somehow that felt like progress. A woman came over to take my order, her smile warm, her eyes kind. For the first time in a long time, I noticed those things. Her name was Jessica, and she had a way of making even the simplest conversation feel easy, light. I found myself smiling back, something I hadn't done in what felt like forever. We talked for a while, about nothing really, and as I left the cafe that night, I felt something unfamiliar. Hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time since my world had fallen apart, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild. Because life, as cruel as it can be, doesn't stop for heartbreak. It keeps moving forward, and maybe, just maybe, so could I. The past was behind me now, and while it would always be a part of my story, it no longer had the power to define me. As I walked into the cool night air, I allowed myself one last glance at the sky above. It was clear now, free of the storm that had once darkened my life.